Good morning and welcome to the Let's Talk Transition podcast for OGV Media Group. I'm Moray Melhuish, the founder of Annet Consulting. We help organisations bring offshore technologies and services to market, and we provide offshore wind farms with interim project management. I'm delighted to have with me today Dan Jackson, founder and director of Cerulean Winds. Dan, can you please introduce yourself and your company?
Yes, good morning, Murray. My name is Dan Jackson. I'm one of the founders of Cerulean Winds with Mark Dixon. Cerulean Winds is a green energy company committed to deliver floating offshore wind for large-scale industrial decarbonisation. The team here, based in London, has an extensive background in offshore engineering. Our DNA is definitely deep water technologies, deep water engineering. But combined with that is large-scale contracting, delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, and in particular, relevant to our conversation today is project finance from the markets and what we would term infrastructure finance being used for renewable projects. Cerulean Winds is been very active in the UK, developing schemes for the decarbonisation of the UKCS oil and gas industry. Ongoing at the moment is the INTOG process run by Crown Estate Scotland, which we hopefully will have the opportunity to talk about. Very exciting times, very fast moving space. It's floating offshore wind, but really that's about big investment for Scotland, big investment in jobs, and a big push in the energy transition and energy security. So that's me.
Right, thanks, Dan. And am I right? I think I've read that you've got in your sights 4 1.5 gigawatt sites for floating offshore wind, potentially generating 10,000 jobs. Is that right?
So the UKCS is an established basin. We have many very old established platforms that have got circa 10 years life left in them. But we also have new opportunities for oil and gas developments, particularly in sort of West of Shetlands, where there's very large opportunities. So the UKCS is a very large basin, and you can break that down by sort of 4 regions, being West of Shetlands, East of Shetlands, or Northern North Sea, and the Central North Sea, and upper part, lower part of the Central North Sea, and the southern part of the Southern North Sea. So we have a very extensive seabed area. Cerulean has approached this with the intent to solve the problem being to decarbonise the oil and gas platforms. Currently, the UKCS produces 18-20 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. The North Sea Transition Deal, which was endorsed by the government, endorsed by BEIS, and endorsed by the industry, came out 2 years ago, and it said basically we're going to halve those emissions by 2030, actually 25% by 2027. So, to solve that problem, to halve those emissions, and those emissions are largely driven by the generation of power on those platforms, you have to look at a basin-wide approach, and you have to look at scale. The INTOG process is a result of the regulators in Scotland and in the UK, the regulatory bodies, the regulatory agencies, the governments, all listening, and they've created a process that it supports large-scale schemes being used to decarbonise the oil and gas platforms across the whole of the UK oil and gas space.
That's fantastic vision and ambition. It's absolutely brilliant. And of course, exactly why we're speaking to you today around the energy transition. Now, when I think about it, 6 gigawatts of floating offshore wind, that's equivalent to about 28% of the new capacity generated by the entire offshore wind industry last year. That's fantastic. What sort of timescales are you working to, Dan, and what challenges do you see ahead?
Well, timeframes is a good question, because the timeframes have actually been set by government. The government with the North Sea Transition Deal set those targets for 2027 and 2030. The oil and gas industry has responded extremely positively to cleaning up its industry, remove those emissions. We're going to removing the best part of 10 million tonnes of CO2 per year. That's the largest decarbonisation project in the UK. So the time frame has been set by government, and the supply chain and developers such as Cerulean are responding to those to that time frame. That time frame is not aggressive. it's necessary, right? So we've committed in COP27, COP26, and what will be endorsed in COP27 is all about this large-scale industrial decarbonisation, removing emissions, and having some big wins. So I think that was the first half of the question was associated with time frame. I just wanted to just touch on them. You know, what are the challenges? There's lots of challenges, but actually there's a lot of people working together to solve those challenges. So if we went back 2 years ago, Cerulean was lobbying the regulators and the government for support for decarbonisation of the oil and gas industry, and they've really come together. There literally is up to a dozen major stakeholders in that regulatory and government mix who are now working together to meet those targets, which is great. Really, really positive, almost unprecedented in terms of bringing together the energy sectors across the government and different regulatory bodies. So that was the first challenge, was getting everybody aligned behind those targets. And I think the North Sea transition deal really nailed that. But there's many other challenges, and one of those challenges is going to be building out this infrastructure within the next 5 to 7, 8 years. And the UK and Scottish supply chain in particular is going to have a lot of investment and a lot of training and a lot of investment in skills and people to deliver on floating offshore wind at this scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And assuming you're successful in your bid, Dan, and I really hope you are, what's the plan to deliver the projects then?
So Cerulean has a set of industrial partners all locked in under exclusivity. We've actually announced our principal floater, which is the tri-floater by NOV. NOV are a very large contractor in the offshore space. We've been very engaged with NOV, with the Scottish supply chain, and actually bodies like the NSTA have been helping facilitate workshops where we brought in the supply chain to help build out the fabrication facilities. So there's a couple of things here really worth mentioning. One is the INTOG process will result in a bow wave of work for the Scottish fabrication yards that is ahead of ScotWind. ScotWind is now 28 plus gigawatts of fixed and floating wind. Huge. But INTOG is actually ahead of that schedule. INTOG is a pull the trigger in 2024, and we will be cutting steel in 2024. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a bit more technical, is that floating offshore wind is a very large floating structure, and it really has to be built, assembled locally to where you want to install it. These things are too big to ship around the world. So if you take fixed offshore wind, where to date, I don't speak out of turn, but to date, most of those fixed offshore wind projects have been using large fabrication facilities overseas or in the Far East, and the offshore installation is using international vessels. So very little touches Scottish quayside. Actually, in floating offshore wind, it's the opposite. You really have to have the structures built along the quayside or in facilities in Scotland, and the shortest possible distance to tow them to site. So there's the build phase, which is a huge requirement for Scottish fabrication yards and resources.
Oh, I think you've broken up for a second.
Am I back,
Dan,
Moray? Am I back? No, I can hear you fine.
Yeah, your poor network quality. Right,
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's with me or with you, but let's. Do you mind just saying that again, and then we'll.
Sure. It shouldn't be with me. If we have it again, just flag it up.
Yeah.
I don't. So just explaining that technically there's without going down a rabbit hole, there's a real requirement for floating offshore wind. The structures are too large to ship, so you really have to build them and assemble them in Scotland, and the tow to site, it has to be as short as possible. So you're really looking for Scottish fabrication yards to have that investment and have the training and people to be able to build and assemble, marshal, and take to and from site from Scotland. It's a very different model to how fixed offshore wind works.
Great. So, I mean, you mentioned there the tri-floater by NOV. Can you share with us, any more details of your supply chain, or actually, what opportunities are there for the supply chain out there, and how do they get involved in your bid and your project?
So the obvious one is to talk about the tri-floater contractor for NOV. We have a consortium of industrial partners that are locked in to Cerulean to provide us the capability to deliver now. Basically, INTOG is about delivering now, so we're aiming to get to FID very quickly and to be able to deliver on 2027. To do that, you have to have large scale, to have the economies of scale, and you have to have the ability to deliver now. So the contractors are locked in. Those contractors are engaged with the supply chain. They have, there's various types of RFIs and requests for data and engagement with the individual fabrication facilities, of which we're party of. And we understand, we're understanding what those challenges are. And those challenges are not necessarily obvious. They're about people, they're about training, the time it takes to build up the training of a workforce. Obviously, there's investment in craneage and just space and all the rest of it. But people and human side of it is one of the things that we've really concentrated on, because this is a lot of jobs that are coming to Scotland in a space that the UK and Scotland has not seen this space for many, many years. And the difference is if you have one large oil platform, which Scotland has done many, it's a one-off. It's a one-off project. This is a production line of units, hundreds of units, all of which are a similar size to a small oil platform, really, in terms of scale and tonnage. So it's a large scale manufacturing facility. It has to be automated, it has to be efficient, but it requires a lot of investment and investment in people as well as infrastructure.
Great, it's great to hear about lots of investment in Scotland and the Scottish supply chain. Dan, certainly that's been mentioned quite a few times. Has that been a conscious decision?
As I just reiterate, really, it's good for Scotland, but actually it's a necessity. It's fixed offshore wind. The developers have got away with is the wrong word, but I'll use it, even though we're on a podcast, because there's efficiencies in the Far East and transporting the components and the units. Floating offshore wind is just too big, and it cannot technically be, you can't tow these things long distances. So there's a requirement, from a technical requirement, to do it in Scotland, but actually overwhelmingly part of the sustainability of this scheme and the sustainability of the energy sector in Scotland and the UK is about investing in the UK supply chain. So INTOG has many benefits to Scotland, but what it really does do is set up the supply chain for the bigger bow wave, which is ScotWind.
Great. Dan, we hear a lot about the opportunities for floating offshore wind combined with green hydrogen. Can you tell us something about your plans in that area?
Yeah, so wind power, whether it's fixed or floating, is intermittent. We want to provide power to the oil and gas platforms. So, for example, if we have a large-scale wind farm, we might be providing power in the north of Scotland 85% of the time. There is an element of time when there is no wind, but most of the time there is excess wind. So if we have for example, if we have a 1 gigawatt wind farm and we have 200 megawatts of power required for the oil and gas facilities we're servicing, that means that 85% of the time, using this example, we would have a significant amount of excess power. That excess power has to be monetized to make everything cost effective and work. And so, you're looking at what can we do with that excess power. The primary purpose here is to decarbonize these oil and gas facilities. Let's get those emissions out the way, save tens of millions of tons of CO2. But the economics require us to monetize the excess power. Also presents a fantastic opportunity for the energy transition. And it's not, there's bottlenecks in the existing grid in the UK and in Scotland to move the power south, green powers, but actually the better opportunity in the short term is to go into hydrogen and hydrogen fuels, or e-fuels, and monetize the excess green power from floating offshore wind, which is a large volume, by going into the energy transition and these new products in the energy transition. And the hydrogen economy and the type of, whether it's ammonia, whether it's methanol, what is going to succeed is a big part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. It'll be exciting to see how that unfolds, won't it? But I completely agree. It's a whole new value stream coming through. You mentioned Intog in Scotland, which is fantastic. What other markets are promising? Where else do you see opening up for Cerulean
But,
in the future?
well, I mean, please, you asked the question actually, because so Cerulean is green energy company, industrial decarbonisation at scale. The easiest win for the UK is to clean up the oil and gas industry. And the oil and gas industry is obviously offshore platforms, but also we have a large amount of onshore downstream facilities and onshore users that are associated with the oil and gas industry. This model for the UK is being looked at very carefully. We are very aware of other jurisdictions around the world that are looking at INTOG and the UK model for what INTOG is going to achieve, to want to apply it to their jurisdictions. So whether that's in Brazil, whether that's the Gulf of Mexico, and COP27 is in Egypt. So Egypt has a similar, very mature basin of oil and gas as the UK. Actually, arguably, so does the Gulf of Mexico, slightly larger, but very mature, lots of old platforms that have got life left in them, but also new opportunities. So these other jurisdictions that we're looking at are to take this UK model and transport it overseas. It's the same model with the same template. But this is very similar to what happened in the oil and gas space with Subsea. The UK led the market, and then we became a centre of excellence. We, as the UK, became a centre of excellence, and that model was translated overseas. So we are very keen that this becomes the UK showcase for cleaning up the oil and gas industry in the UK, and that leads the market for others to follow.
Great. Dan, if I might, this year, 2022, energy security has become a major issue for Western Europe. How can offshore wind speed up the project cycle? You mentioned that Intog is ahead of Scotland. That's great. But how do we really get behind offshore wind and really make it happen at scale and pace?
Well, I think energy security is, for unfortunate reasons, is absolutely front and center for every government, particularly governments in Europe and the UK. So energy security is about how do we make sure that we give enough time and space for our oil and gas industry to continue under the right terms, whilst the renewable sector. UK has a massive amount of renewable energy that is largely still untapped. Virtually nothing is being used of what we have available. So we just need the time. So we need the oil and gas industry to clean itself up, clean up its act, and have more time. So the oil and gas industry can proceed on the basis of minimal or very little emissions. So actually this is where floating offshore wind is where the renewables and the oil and gas expertise comes together. So what we're doing is we're putting a different working practices into the oil and gas industry, cleaning it up, remove those emissions, and actually enable it to last an awful lot longer because it's on a different basis. It's on a clean, very low emissions basis. And that gives time for the build out of the renewables in the UK. And actually, there's technologies such as batteries and other technologies that are complementary to fixed and floating offshore wind that are also coming on at great pace. So we just need to have a bit more time. So energy security is not about trying to solve it on one day. It's about laying out a plan for the next 20 years so that the lights don't go off and we have a sensible transition. And I think what INTOG is doing and what Cerulean is doing is providing that basis for the oil and gas industry to go forward.
Well, do you think there are any policy changes that need to happen to accelerate progress in this area?
Well, I mean, again, very topical given the what's going on in the world of politics, which is outside of my what we read in the paper. But very topical. Good question, because what we've seen is the governments recognizing the need to accelerate renewables. They need to remove the bureaucracy, but they're doing that. As I said when we started the call, we've seen huge differences in the space of the last 2 years with bodies within government agencies, within regulators now working together in forums. We are certainly part of forums with multilateral discussions, which have never happened before, as they're trying to speed up and remove the red tape and the bureaucracy. So consenting is a great example, which traditionally for a fixed wind farm close to shore would take many years and quite rightly have lots of checks and balances. We're hundreds of miles offshore. I mean, the floating wind farms to power the oil and gas facilities are sited amongst the oil and gas platforms. So the consenting logically should be, as an environmental consenting and consideration, should be possible to accelerate it and to leverage a lot of the knowledge and experience from the oil and gas space. We're within the oil and gas platforms. So, you know, there's the governments are concentrating their efforts to speed up the transition.
Great. And Dan, earlier you mentioned the COP27 climate conference that's coming up in Egypt this November. What decisions would you like to see made there?
I think it's, you know, there has been a journey to install targets for emissions. We've seen the UK lead that with implementing things like INTOG for how you know, we said we're going to, we as a government said we're going to do something, and now we're doing it, and we're going to do that by the time we said we're going to do it. I think that's brilliant. I think COP27 should be about rolling what we're doing here out amongst other jurisdictions. It's in Egypt. Egypt is a very similar oil and gas basin to the UK. One thing I would like to see is the Egyptian government taking the same stance as what they did at COP26 and saying we're going to clean up our oil and gas industry, and that has a lot of life left in it. The gas industry in particular in Egypt, but that infrastructure is onshore, very similar to the UK. So out of COP27, I would certainly like to see reinforcement of the targets that have been set at COP26 and the North Sea transition deal, and actually other governments stepping up and saying, okay, we can follow what the UK is doing.
Really, Dan, you've clearly got some brilliant vision and, you know, yeah, an incredible scale of vision for Cerulean Winds. Can you take us through the journey so far? How did you come to found the business? How did you come by the vision? And what have your biggest challenges to date been?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an easy question actually, because come back to the DNA of the team. The founding team is obviously deep water technologies, deep water structures, floating structures, and you had to wait for the right entry point. Floating offshore wind reached that entry point a couple of years ago with and principally it's scale of the turbines. People think that, you know, the technologies, this is where the oil and gas expertise comes in. It's floating structures, it's deep water, but actually the scale of the turbines. Cerulean is using 15 megawatt turbines. They're very far ashore, they're very large, they're not possible to see them from the beach, but they're very large structures. And the scale of those turbines means the economics are broken through the need for subsidies. And more importantly, they're competitive with other forms of power generation. And that was a couple of years ago. Obviously, the cost of power generation, particularly in the UK and Europe, is gas-based. I think it's 44% of the UK's power is using gas power generation. Gas prices have gone through the roof, and suddenly the economics for fixed and floating offshore wind look very favourable. But, you know, 2 years back, that was the transition. Was the scale of the turbines had reached a point where floating offshore wind was competitive, and that's just got a whole load better. And our background from other businesses has been not only in the technical side of offshore, but also in integrated contracting, project finance, and large-scale infrastructure projects. So putting together these types of schemes we're using from INTOG is really a culmination of several other businesses over the last 20 odd years. And I think you need all of those disciplines to have the benefits of integrated contracting, having what we have, which is a set of industrial partners, what we call a industrial delivery consortium, locked in behind us prior to going into a leasing round, is unique, absolutely unique. We have every player that we need to deliver the project is in place. And that's before we've actually submitted the formal application to the regulator. The project finance is in place. So these are very large individual schemes. They're multiple phases and what have you, but each phase is approximately £6 to £7 billion of projects. So you need the market infrastructure finance to come in right at the very beginning to be part of the journey. So integrated contracting, project finance, that's the DNA of what we've done before, and that's what we brought into Cerulean.
That's it's quite a scale of project finance required, and of course that doesn't come as a surprise. Can you share who's behind Cerulean, who your backers are?
We're the industrial partners that it's competitive process of what's going on with Intog, but I think we've been in the market as appropriate with the likes of Societe Generale, Piper Sandler's another one. There's a number of serious players that are comfortable with these types of scale projects in the renewable sector. It's a balance between what's new and what's hydrogen economy is an element of uncertainty with that, but actually what there is certainty in is the near and immediate demand of the oil and gas industry within the next 5 to 7 years to take large amounts of power, green power, to power their platforms. That will die off. That will reduce over the next 20 years. So as the oil and gas power demands reduce over the next 20 years, naturally, because we are running out of oil and gas over the next 20 years, running it down, you have to take that green power and you have to monetize it through other routes to market, and particularly what we would call the hydrogen economy, ammonia and e-fuels.
Brilliant. And one question that we always ask on the podcast is, this might be pretty obvious, but Dan, how do you define success for Cerulean Winds?
So I think there's two things here really important. I think one is, if the UK can decarbonize its oil and gas industry, I think it's fantastic, right? That's been my background when I started life as an engineer when I was 21, and to change, absolute transformational change in the oil and gas industry will lead the market, right? Reducing or significantly reducing the emissions from the oil and gas. To be part of that, I think is brilliant, right? It's a very exciting ride. Cerulean Wind's success is to have a major part of those wind farms that are providing that power to those oil and gas facilities. So we are a developer that are originating these wind farms, putting them in, installing them. We're going to operate large-scale wind farms. But actually, the bigger picture is, what the UK is doing right now is absolutely leading the market.
Fantastic. And if you don't mind, Dan, I'd like to leave on a personal question just to get to understand you better. How do you define success for yourself personally?
I think it's being a founder of a business that has this sort of ambition, and as to be part of a serious part of an energy transformation process like this, it makes you very proud. And I think that's it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And proud you should be too. That's fantastic. So that brings us to the end of our podcast today. On behalf of OGV Renewables, Annet Consulting, and of course myself personally, I'd like to thank you, Dan Jackson, co-founder rather of Cerulean Winds, for joining us today. I'm pretty sure everyone will agree that your vision and plans are truly inspiring. So thank you for joining us today and for sharing them with us. And good luck to Cerulean on your Intog bid, of course. We hope to have you back on to find out more about that in due course.
Thank you very much, and I welcome the opportunity to come back.